My wife is a total skeptic. She does not believe in the paranormal whatsoever and never has. But when I told her just a portion of today's story, specifically the part about the passenger in first class, you'll know when you get to that scene, she told me she was so intrigued by it. And I think the reason for that is in this story, as you'll see, there were so many witnesses, hundreds of witnesses. And so how could they all be making this up? But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come over your house for a Ouija board session, and then after everyone has their fingers on the pointer, ask if anyone likes the like button, and then casually push the pointer towards no. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 8:30 p.m. on December 29, 1972, passengers inside of JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, which included the 13 crew members, had made it on board, and then at that point, the 13 crew members began making their final preparations for takeoff. Flight 401 was a very expensive and recently introduced model of plane by Eastern Airlines called the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, and it was both unbelievably technologically advanced and unbelievably enormous. It sat up to 400 passengers, which meant instead of having 4 seats to a row like you would expect inside of a passenger jet, the L-1011s had 8 seats per row, and they had 2 levels. There was the main level, which was the main cabin where all the passengers were, and then there was a second level, a lower level, that was only accessible via 2 small elevators that could barely fit 1 person inside of them in the back of the aircraft. And down on this lower level was a full-size kitchen, which had ovens and refrigerators, and also at the back of this lower level was a lounge area for flight staff. The pilot that night was Bob Loft, who was a strikingly handsome 55-year-old man with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, which for reference is a ton of flying experience. Captain Bob was known as a perfectionist who exuded confidence and who was cool under pressure. After Bob had boarded the aircraft, he had made his way right into the cockpit.
I remember this one time traveling, it was during the pandemic, and I had just landed at an airport in Florida. I can't remember which one in Florida. I don't know if it was Orlando or Tampa, but it was one of them. Anyway, I remember walking through the airport. It was super quiet, like I was spinning in circles to see was anybody ever going to show up. Nobody was around. It was like eerie how quiet the airport had been. Now, mind you, I've been in a lot of airports at this time. This was 2020 or 2021, one of them. And we know what was going on during that time. But I have been in enough airports to know that that was odd that such a large airport was that empty. Anyway, I kept walking and I turned and it's like a terminal opened up. I guess you could say a terminal. I don't know what it was. And there were maybe a dozen people there in a line. And we were going through TSA, and this was before I had TSA pre-check, so I had to take off my shoes and all that good old stuff, wait on my turn to put them on the belt. And I noticed that up ahead, because it was so quiet, literally no TSA agents were talking. It was the oddest thing. It was so silent. So I had enough time to like look around, scope my environment, scope the scene and all that stuff. At the end of the TSA line, there was this TSA agent who had some kind of like big bottle. It was like a spray bottle. And I was squinting my eyes. I was looking real close and I could not tell what was in the spray bottle. I couldn't tell what was in it. I couldn't see a clear label. But he wasn't talking either. He was like gesturing to people to extend their arms. So they would hold out their arms and he would spray them. He would spray both of their arms. He would gesture for them to flip their arms over. They would do so, and he would spray the underside of both of their arms. Next person, same thing, gesture to spray. Hold your arms out. They'll hold them out, spray. He'll gesture to flip. They will flip them, spray. Nobody said a word to this man about what was going on. So in my head, I'm thinking to myself, he ain't finna spray me with no stuff, and I don't know what he's spraying me with. You know, during that time, there was a lot of weird stuff going on, and I don't be falling for the okie doke with nothing. And so the guy in front of me, he was an Asian guy, and I noticed that he was watching just like I was watching. And so I think we both noticed that so many people had been up to the line that it got to the point where they weren't having to be gestured anymore. They would just walk up and automatically hold their arms out, get sprayed, automatically flip their arms over to be sprayed. They would get their stuff and they would leave. I just thought all of this was so strange. And so the guy in front of me, I guess he had caught on too. So when he was done, he walks up. He was an older guy. He walks up. He held his arms out and he flipped them over to be sprayed. I didn't have the look of, you know how people be walking up with that look of, you better not play with me. I didn't do that. I just walked up with my mind set. He's going to explain to me what this is, or, you know, we're going to have a tussle in this airport, because I get in an argument with TSA every time I go somewhere anyway. And so I walked up and I just looked at him, and for the first time he spoke, he literally said, "Thank you, have a nice day." I said, "Thank you, you do the same." I got my stuff and I walked off. I looked over my shoulder. The person behind me, a chump, held their arms out and they got sprayed. I went over to the older Asian gentleman, and we were sitting beside each other, putting on our shoes, and he said to me, "Boy, that was weird, huh?" And I said, "Yeah, that was really weird." And he said, "I don't know what they sprayed us with." I said, "I don't know what they sprayed you all with either, because I didn't get sprayed." He was like, "You didn't get sprayed?" I said, "No, I didn't get sprayed. Have a nice day and safe travels." Now, why am I telling you that story? It sounds like it was a dream, like how quiet the airport was and what's all that stuff. It sounds like a dream, but it was actually real life. And I'm telling you that story because it really made me think about how easy it is for people to be programmed. How easy it is for people to see a thing happen enough times to where now you're programmed in your mind that this is what it is, this is how it goes, so on and so forth. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what's about to happen, but I want you to take that as a sign. You watching this story, if you got all the way this far, take it as a sign that you are not to let them program your mind. I don't care what you see everybody else doing. If it doesn't look right, if it doesn't feel right, if something isn't checking well with you, I don't care what. Make up in your mind, it won't happen to me. I'm not doing it. I'm not falling for it.
We've all heard of haunted homes, but have you heard of haunted airplanes? This is the story of Flight 401. It was the summer of 1973. Eastern Airline flight attendant Enid Grigg was working her shift. Then suddenly she started feeling like she was coming down with the flu or a stomach bug. So she goes ahead and asks the senior flight attendant if she can go down to the galley to rest, because she didn't want the people on board to see her like that. If you don't know what a galley is, it's pretty much a kitchen or a prepping area for food on a ship or boat or aircraft. Anyways, the senior flight attendant allows her to rest in the galley area since they weren't too busy. She said, "You'll be alone down there and no one will bother you, so go get some sleep, get better." So she goes down there, throws a pillow on the floor, and tries to doze off. Moments later, Enid gets a really weird feeling, like something isn't right. She was told that she would be down there alone, yet she has this weird feeling that someone else is down there with her. All of a sudden, she sees a pilot looking down at her with a serious look on his face. Embarrassed, she kept apologizing for sleeping where she was sleeping, and while she was trying to explain herself, he just stared at her. No facial expressions, no words, nothing. Then he walks off. So now, desperate to make amends, she goes over to the senior flight attendant. She asks, "Hey, did you see the pilot come down here? I want to apologize again. I don't really want to get fired over this." The senior flight attendant says, "No, nobody went down there. I was here at the door the whole time. Nobody walked past me." Enid was so confused, but she still wanted to make things right, so she goes over to the cockpit and says, "I'm real sorry that one of you guys saw me down there like that. I wasn't feeling well, so I really needed to lie down." But the guys working there were also confused. They said, "None of us were down there. We've been up here the whole time." Enid gets the shivers. She was feeling even more sick because she can't make out what just happened. She knew for sure that she saw someone standing over her, and that person was indeed a pilot. So Enid is also a skeptic, and she doesn't believe in ghosts, but she knows what she saw. However, to this day, she can't explain it. Enid is not the only Eastern Airline employee to experience this around this time. Neil Holland, a former Eastern Airline pilot, explains that there's many people that reported experiencing unusual events on the plane. Even the vice president of Eastern Airlines had an experience on board. Another thing these reports have in common is that they all saw the same people. Witnesses even said they recognized the staff, Captain Bob Loft and Don Repo. They recognized them because Bob and Don died a year prior on Flight 401. Flight 401 was a scheduled flight nonstop from New York to Miami. On December 29, 1972, the United States suffered one of the worst disasters in its aviation history. Captain Bob Loft was in command of the flight. He was 55 years old with 32 years of experience working for Eastern Airlines. His flight crew included First Officer Albert John Burt Stockstill and Flight Engineer Donald Repo. There was nothing that was out of the ordinary about the takeoff of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 on December 29, 1972. Everything was going smoothly for almost the entire flight. The flight arrived at 11:30 p.m. and at the final approach, when the gear was lowered, the nose gear light failed to turn on. The nose gear light is an indicator that the landing gear at the bottom of the nose of the plane is ready to be landed, which is absolutely vital for landing. The crew called for a go-around because the gear was unsafe, so they decided not to land yet. The first officer reported that the green light, which would indicate the landing gear was down, was not on. Captain Bob Loft and Engineer Don Repo had quickly headed down to the avionics bay. However, when the captain turned back to his engineer, he accidentally brushed up against the controls and inadvertently placed the plane into a slow descent. So around this time, they were over the Everglades in Florida, and they did not realize that they were slowly descending. And the alarm, designed to warn the flight crew that they had fallen below 2,000 feet, went unnoticed because the engineer wasn't seated in his seat to hear it. The left wing hit the swamp first, and the rest of the plane followed. The aircraft skidded across the marshy water. The airliner's cockpit and main cabin disintegrated upon impact. Thankfully, there were no explosions. The plane's remaining fuel leaked into the swamp rather than being ignited. Luckily for the survivors, help was on its way. Robert Marquis and Ray Dickinson were out fishing in a flyboat when they noticed the crash. They immediately sprang into action, pulling out as many people as they could from the swampy waters. Robert received burns all over his body from the spilled jet fuel as he rescued people one by one until medics arrived at the scene. 101 people died in the crash, while 75 survived. It turned out that the indicator light just had a faulty bulb, and the nose landing gear was fine all along. However, the pilot and his crew were unaware of that. Throughout the years, more ghostly encounters persisted. For example, there was a pilot sitting next to a passenger, and with multiple people on board as witnesses, a stewardess asked if he was okay. The pilot then simply vanished. 10 people were a witness to that. Some passengers even threw up. They had to stop the flight because of that particular incident. Then a couple years later, the airline made a stunning admission. It turned out that the airline salvaged a bunch of the parts from the crash and installed it into several places onto different planes. And coincidentally, all of the encounters that took place were around the salvaged materials. One flight attendant even saw pilot Don Repo inside of an oven looking out, which freaked her out and caused a commotion on that flight. By the end of the year, there were a wave of reports to the airline begging them to remove the remaining components from the fleet. So the airline complied. Ghostly encounters and apparitions plummeted since the removal of the parts, but a couple encounters still persisted until the demise of Eastern Airlines in 1991. Do you believe in the afterlife?
This is one of the creepiest ghost stories I've ever heard, and it's really the main reason I chose to do this creepy transit series. So let's talk about the ghosts of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. So this was a flight in December of 1972 that unfortunately crashed outside of Miami, Florida in the Everglades. Basically, the pilots had gotten distracted with a burnt out light in the cockpit. One of the pilots accidentally disengaged autopilot, and then the plane slowly lost altitude and crashed. This is where it gets insane. So after the crash, they took pieces of the plane, of the wreckage that were salvageable, and put them into other planes. And then in the months that followed, people that flew and worked on these planes started to report seeing the ghosts of the deceased passengers. There was even a pilot who was asked to go speak to a passenger in the cabin because the flight attendants couldn't get him to respond and he wasn't on their manifest. When the captain went out to talk to him, he recognized him as the pilot of Flight 401. And there were multiple other stories of people seeing the pilot from Flight 401, including one where he was in the cockpit before a flight and he warned the crew about a faulty electrical circuit. And then there actually was a faulty electrical circuit that had to be fixed before the flight. It got so bad that Eastern Airlines actually told its employees allegedly to stop talking about ghost stories or they would be fired. The CEO of Eastern called these ghost stories garbage, but despite that, Eastern allegedly ended up removing the salvaged parts and the ghost stories slowly stopped.
I don't think I'll ever take a red-eye flight again. So this happened last month. I had a window seat. It was on row 17 and we were flying overnight. Nothing crazy at first, everything was normal. They dimmed the cabin lights, people were settling in. You just hear kind of the hum of the airplane, you know, as you hit the altitude. It was somewhere about an hour in, and I noticed a man. He was sitting across the aisle, and the whole time he had not moved. He never adjusted, he never settled, he just sat there staring straight. I don't even know if I noticed him really blinking. He was just staring straight ahead. At first I wondered if he just fell asleep with his eyes open or something, but then the lady came by and she offered him a drink and he didn't even respond. He didn't even look at her. And she asked again and it was still nothing. So she leaned in just a little bit closer and she started to laugh a little awkwardly, like maybe he's just ignoring her. But as she leaned in, her expression changed immediately after staring at him. She just kind of straightened up and she said, "Okay, I'll just come back," and then she walked off as quick as you can through the airplane aisle. I think that was the moment when I started to feel more uneasy. And then an hour passed again, and everybody was mostly asleep. I was having a hard time sleeping because I was still thinking about this weird man across the aisle. I kept glancing over at him. He still wasn't moving until I saw his head slowly turn back, and it wasn't like a normal turn. It was really slow and it looked unnatural. But I swear on my life, he turned back and he looked exactly, like directly at my face. I sat there frozen and he started to smile, but it wasn't a smile that reached his eyes like a normal person. It was just stiff and it got wide and it was really creepy. Then he mouthed something. I couldn't hear over the airplane engine, but from what it looked like he said, "Don't fall asleep." I immediately sat up and I pressed the call button, and the same attendee came to help me that helped him earlier. And I pointed over at him, trying not to panic, and she just got really pale and she looked at me and she said, "He's not supposed to be there." I thought she was joking, but it was clear that she was not. She called another attendee over to her, and they both went to go walk up to this man, and when they got there, they just stopped, like fully stopped. And I tried to peek over at why they were stopping, and the man wasn't there. The seat was empty, there was no stuff there. It was like he was never sitting there. And I looked around the aisles, nobody in the aisles, the bathrooms were empty. I don't know where he went. That was until I noticed something. When I looked over my right shoulder and I looked at my window to glance out, it was a bit foggy, and it was like somebody had written something with their finger. And it said, "You almost did." I didn't sleep for the rest of the flight after that. When we landed, I asked the crew if somebody had been sitting in that seat, and they just looked at me and they said that seat's been unassigned the entire flight.
For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you two of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these two women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these two women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine, and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the two women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was. And they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those two elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards.
A woman on a flight in 2023 at Dallas International Airport caused panic when she desperately begged to be let off the plane and urged other passengers to leave with her, claiming she could see a phantom figure on board that posed a deadly threat to everyone. The aircraft was preparing to fly to Orlando, and in the video, some passengers can be seen nervously looking around, unable to see what she was describing. The chaos led to a delay of nearly 4 hours, and the woman was eventually escorted off the plane along with other passengers and taken to a security room, where she continued insisting that everyone on the flight was in serious danger. Police thoroughly searched the aircraft and initially found nothing unusual, but engineers later decided to recheck the plane's technical condition. During this inspection, they discovered that the rear landing gear release mechanism was jammed, meaning the wheels might not deploy properly during landing, potentially causing a catastrophic accident. After this, dispatchers reviewed footage from the plane's onboard camera, and what they reportedly saw shocked everyone, making it seem as though the woman may have been right all along. You can find these clips yourself by searching on TikTok for "Woman Saw a Phantom on a Plane."
Did you know that dead pilots have been spotted working flights years after they died in a crash? December 29th, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 slammed into the Florida Everglades. 101 people died, but that wasn't the end. Within months, crew members on other Eastern flights started reporting something strange. They'd see Captain Bob Loft in cockpits, checking instruments. Flight engineer Don Repo would appear in galleys, warning about mechanical problems. More than 20 sightings were filed with the FAA. A flight attendant watched Repo inspect an oven that later caught fire. He'd warned her about it minutes before. Pilots had full conversations with Loft about flight plans and weather. Normal workplace talk. Only later, when shown photographs, did they realize they'd been speaking to dead men. The encounters always happened on planes containing salvaged parts from the crashed aircraft. Eastern Airlines quietly began removing every recovered component after employees refused to work on those planes. The sightings stopped, but the reports remain in FAA files. Conversations with ghosts who never knew they were dead.
Even the flight attendant, with her eyes open, seemed to notice nothing. The woman jolted awake, and everything around her returned to normal. She held her daughter tightly, but the unease in her heart only grew stronger, because from the moment they boarded, there had been something deeply strange about this plane. Soon, the plane hit violent turbulence, and an old man in the back suddenly collapsed from a medical emergency. The woman was a doctor, so she rushed forward to save him. But while she was giving him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the old man suddenly opened his lifeless white eyes, grabbed her collar, and muttered a strange chant. The woman backed away in terror, and the old man stopped breathing completely. While everyone gathered around the body in panic, the woman saw a dark shadow flash past the back row. The turbulence grew worse. Oxygen masks dropped from above, and fear quickly spread through the entire cabin. After calming her daughter down, the woman told the reporter beside her about the plane crash she had survived 20 years earlier. In that accident, she had seen an old woman chanting, and then the plane crashed, leaving her as a survivor. The reporter thought she was only suffering from old trauma, but the daughter said she had seen an old woman too, and she had drawn the location of row 19 right after that. The captain announced that because of the weather and a passenger's death, the plane would make an emergency landing. When the woman heard the name of the airport, her face turned pale.
Today we're going to talk about a haunted airplane, and yes, this actually happened. December 29th of 1972, Flight 401 descended from New York City and was heading to Miami. Unfortunately, it never made it there. So the pilots got an indicator that the landing gear did not go the way it was supposed to, so they kept looking at it, researching it, and they did not realize that they had clicked on autopilot and the plane just kept flying. Eventually, they hit the Florida Everglades, and 176 passengers were on board, and 101 of them perished. The pilot, Robert Loft, had perished, and also Donald Repo had both perished on this flight. Because this plane still had parts of it that were good, the company decided to use those parts in other planes, and that is when people started noticing things. Within a few months of this plane crashing, there were new people on different flights, and they were seeing apparitions. They were seeing people that looked just like their old captains that used to be on this plane, which was Robert Loft. There was one story where one of the flight attendants was doing a head count, and all of a sudden she had one more person, and she saw that it was a pilot sitting in her row, and she thought, well, maybe he just jumped on for the layover, and so she went up to him and started talking to him, and he wouldn't reply to her. So she went and got her other coworker, and then by that time the pilot of this plane had came up to see what the commotion was, and he went white as a ghost, and he said, oh my god, that's Pilot Loft. He was the one who died in that crash. Other instances was where Donald Repo, who was the plane engineer who had died in Flight 401, had came to one of the flight attendants and let them know that there was a fire on board. They, of course, were freaked out because Donald Repo had passed away. How would this person know this? They start investigating, checking over the plane, and sure enough, there was, if they would have taken off, something that would have malfunctioned and probably caught the plane on fire. There are lots of other instances where people saw apparitions. They saw people walking by that looked like they're not supposed to be here, and they were right. So people started talking about this, and the Eastern Airlines did not like all this commotion. It was giving them a bad reputation, and they kept telling their employees, no, that's not true, don't even believe that. And they're like, no, we saw it firsthand. So eventually Eastern Airlines went and they took back every single part that they had put on these other planes, took them off, and to this day there have been no more sightings of Robert Loft or Donald Repo. Now, how is that for a wild airplane ride?
Two men saved potentially hundreds of people from meeting their demise in an airplane crash. The strangest part about that is the two men were in fact ghosts. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 departed from the JFK airport in New York and crashed in the Florida Everglades. All three cockpit crew members, 2 flight attendants, and 96 passengers passed away. So Eastern Airlines did the obvious thing and recycled parts from the motor of the crashed plane. They put these parts on an active passenger jet, and crew members started to report seeing ghostly apparitions of the 2 pilots, along with ghostly passengers. But when the pilot and co-pilot Don Repo and Bob Loft was seen, they would warn the crew of faulty parts. And the crew reported that it was different than seeing the other apparitions like the passenger apparitions, because they would also feel an impending doom coming from these ghosts. Finally, after several crew members had repeatedly heard the warnings from these 2 ghosts, they were able to convince the airline to check on the parts, which were in fact faulty and could have caused another catastrophic.
In 1972, Flight 401 crashed in the Florida Everglades, taking nearly 100 lives. The Lockheed L1011 TriStar was lost, but its story endured. Salvaged parts were installed onto other Eastern Airlines planes. Soon after, the sightings began. Crew members reported seeing ghosts, specifically Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo. They appeared in cockpits, sometimes speaking to pilots. They issued warnings. One attendant claimed Repo warned, "Turn the altitude control. You're flying too low." Moments later, a warning light flashed. They were dangerously close to the ground. Pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew repeatedly encountered the spectral pair. Some believed the ghosts were preventing tragedies, guiding living aircraft. It became an aviation legend. The apparitions continued until the last salvaged parts were removed from service. Only then did the sightings cease. The spirit of Flight 401 seemed to find peace. But what if parts carry more than metal? What if they carry a soul?
Yo, hold on. This is sick because when I saw this TikTok, I was in the airport. Now, this is going viral as fuck. Yeah. Now, TikToks are showing up of this woman that was on an airplane, and she's screaming that person isn't real. That person's not real, and she's trying to get away from somebody she's sitting beside. This is the footage.
Yo.
It's fucked. So the theory is
that in airports there's like
bots? It's unavailable. Yo. Okay, if the next one, because I saved 2 videos.
Yeah.
If the next one's unavailable too, they're trying to hide it. Yo, hold on. If it's not on YouTube, it's fucked. No, Gavin, when I tell you, bro, this is a genuine reaction of this lady. Now, she's saying that this person was shape-shifting in front of her.
Oh, nah.
And she saw him shapeshift, and she made a whole scene on the plane. And she was, but the way she was screaming and the way she was communicating, dog, like, she wasn't fucking lying. And you know, like, she's there. She's all there. Yeah. I'll show you.
Holy shit.
I'm gonna try and find it on YouTube. If it's not there, then it's fucked.
Hello, my name is Sydney. I'm a flight attendant. If you don't know that, which you probably don't, because I don't have a lot of followers. But anyways, that's me. My name is Sydney. I'm a flight attendant. And I've always wanted to do like a spooky, scary ghost story. But like, how do I make that flight attendant content? But then I had a pilot tell me a story about Flight 401. And I think it is just... it was perfect. So let's get started. On December 29th, 1972, which just happens to be my birthday, not in 1972, but weird. There was an Eastern Airlines flight flying from New York to Miami. So these people, they were trying to party, you know, and they did not get a party. The flight left at 9:20 p.m. from JFK Airport with 176 passengers on board. Everything was going fine and the plane was landing at 11:30 p.m. into Miami. Well, they did not end up making it to the Miami International Airport because they smashed into the Everglades instead. They did that instead. I'm not very good at making this spooky, but that's what happened. The captain ended up dying in the crash not long after, and the first officer died in the hospital after that. And in total, 101 passengers and flight crew ended up dying on this plane crash. As you can imagine, it smashed into the fucking Everglades. This is actually very surprising because 75 people actually survived this plane crash. If that makes you ever feel any better, you could survive. So, at the time, this was the highest death toll rate of any single airplane crash in the United States. Now, as if this was not tragic enough, things started to get spooky, scary, ghostly after this. Now, the captain's name was Bob Loft, and the first officer's name was Don Repo. And over the next year and a half, Eastern Airline employees were seeing sightings of the captain and the first officer, which, as you can tell, is pretty strange because they are not with us anymore. Sorry, that was insensitive. They have moved on. They've passed into another life. They would see their reflections in the galleys. When passengers would open overhead bins, they would see reflections. The cockpit crew in another Eastern Airlines flight claimed to have seen Repo, the captain, sitting amongst them in the cockpit, and he was warning them about a faulty electrical circuit which had since been fixed. Weird. The vice president of Eastern Airlines even saw him on a flight from JFK. Is that not suspicious and weird? The CEO was kind of putting off the stories and didn't want any attention with the ghost sightings at all, which kind of makes sense. And if any airline crew members reported seeing any ghosts, they would have them go to the company shrinks. And management would go as far as to say that they would fire any employees who brought up any ghost stories, period. Go to part 2 because it gets wild.
Did you know that dead pilots kept appearing on commercial flights for years after a deadly crash? In December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed in the Florida Everglades, killing Captain Bob Loft and flight engineer Don Repo. But their deaths were just the beginning of something much stranger. Eastern Airlines salvaged parts from the wreckage and installed them on other planes in their fleet. That's when crew members started seeing the ghosts of Loft and Repo on active flights. Flight attendants watched in shock as the dead captain appeared in the cockpit, warning about equipment failures. Passengers reported seeing Repo performing safety checks in the galley, only to vanish when approached. One flight attendant recognized Repo sitting in her section and tried to serve him dinner. When she looked again, he was gone. Another crew member saw Captain Loft in the cockpit so clearly that she tried to report an unauthorized person on the flight deck. Eastern Airlines quietly replaced the salvaged parts and banned employees from discussing the encounters, but the sightings had already created one of corporate America's most documented supernatural cases, with hundreds of witnesses reporting encounters with the helpful ghosts.
This creepy clip shows people boarding a non-existent plane. If you look closely, you can see the people are not from our time. They look like they are from the 1940s. Are they ghosts, or is this a time slip caught on camera? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next one.
She was on a plane when she noticed something strange outside her window. At first, she didn't think much of it, but minutes after takeoff, the plane was hit by violent turbulence. She began panicking, saying it felt like someone had taken control of the aircraft. Then, the video cut out. Weeks later, floating suitcases were found in the ocean, but no passengers were ever recovered. She had just arrived home when something strange happened. Feeling uneasy, she called the caretaker to investigate. He hesitated at first, but eventually went up to check, though he never told her what he found. Later, she and her husband decided to look for themselves and discovered something unsettling. They found a blanket, a pillow, and shoe prints along with peepholes in the attic door, clear signs that someone had been living, or at least sleeping there. Concerned, they reported it to the building owner, who responded by locking the attic door to prevent further access.
This is one of the creepiest ghost stories I've ever heard, and it's really the main reason I chose to do this creepy transit series. So let's talk about the ghosts of Eastern Airlines Flight 401. So this was a flight in December of 1972 that unfortunately crashed outside of Miami, Florida in the Everglades. Basically, the pilots had gotten distracted with a burnt out light in the cockpit. One of the pilots accidentally disengaged autopilot, and then the plane slowly lost altitude and crashed. This is where it gets insane. So after the crash, they took pieces of the plane, of the wreckage that were salvageable, and put them into other planes. And then in the months that followed, people that flew and worked on these planes started to report seeing the ghosts of the deceased passengers. There was even a pilot who was asked to go speak to a passenger in the cabin because the flight attendants couldn't get him to respond and he wasn't on their manifest. When the captain went out to talk to him, he recognized him as the pilot of Flight 401. And there were multiple other stories of people seeing the pilot from Flight 401, including one where he was in the cockpit before a flight and he warned the crew about a faulty electrical circuit. And then there actually was a faulty electrical circuit that had to be fixed before the flight. It got so bad that Eastern Airlines actually told its employees, allegedly, to stop talking about ghost stories or they would be fired. CEO of Eastern called these ghost stories garbage, but despite that, Eastern allegedly ended up removing the salvaged parts and the ghost stories slowly stopped.
This woman claimed she saw something on the plane that wasn't human.
I'm not going to.
During a flight, a woman suddenly became extremely frightened and started demanding to get off the plane. She kept pointing toward the back and insisting that someone she saw wasn't a human being. Her reaction was so intense that other passengers began wondering what she had actually seen. The video quickly spread online, and people started claiming she had encountered a skinwalker or some other unknown creature. She continued saying that the thing behind her was not real, and she seemed genuinely terrified. Reports suggested the woman had become upset during an argument involving allegedly stolen property, and she desperately wanted to leave the plane. Still, the original footage had already gone viral, with thousands of people convinced that she had seen something that wasn't human. So what do you think she really saw?
After a plane crash in 1972, airline employees started reporting bizarre occurrences on planes that used salvaged materials from the crash. They said they saw dead crew members from the ill-fated Flight 401, and these crew members warned them about potential weather dangers and mechanical failure. The stories became so popular that they soon inspired a book and a television movie. And so this very real tragedy quickly grew into a famous American ghost story.
What would you do if a pilot who died in a plane crash suddenly appeared aboard your flight and calmly warned the crew about danger ahead? Would you trust what you were seeing, or convince yourself it was impossible? This is what followed the crash of Flight 401. It happened in the Florida Everglades on December 29, 1972. It was a dark tragedy that would haunt the skies and the minds of pilots for many years to come. The L-1011 was approaching Miami. Its crew became distracted by a faulty landing gear light. While they searched for the problem, the jet descended into the marsh. 101 people died, including Captain Robert Loft and flight engineer Donald Repo. Months later, parts from the wreckage were reportedly installed in other aircraft. Then the strange sightings began. Flight attendants claimed Repo's face appeared inside a galley panel. Pilots reported Loft in the cockpit before vanishing. In one encounter, Repo allegedly warned of a mechanical problem moments before it was found. The report spread through the airline. Many sightings happened aboard planes carrying salvaged pieces of Flight 401. Eventually, those parts were removed. Soon afterward, the apparitions reportedly stopped, yet the mystery survived. More than 50 years later, some believe Loft and Repo returned. They came not to frighten the living, but to protect them. Somewhere above Florida, perhaps the final crew of Flight 401 is still watching the skies. They are forever on duty.
For almost 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airline employees began to experience a terrifying phenomenon. Now, at first, many of these employees were going to their superiors and reporting what happened to them, but very early on, Eastern Airlines made it clear that they didn't want anybody to talk about this. Anytime an employee made one of these reports about this phenomenon, they were either sent to the psychiatrist or they were just fired. However, despite this intense pressure from Eastern Airlines to their employees to be quiet about what was going on inside of their ranks, there were still some very brave employees who had firsthand experience with this terrifying phenomenon who still came forward and told their stories to the press and to journalists. They just did it anonymously. And so I'm going to tell you 2 of the most chilling accounts from those employees. Keep in mind, the names used in these stories have all been changed. In March of 1973, so 3 months after Flight 401 had crashed in the Everglades, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her on this flight was her very close friend and fellow flight attendant, a woman named Denise. Neither of these 2 women were on Flight 401 when it crashed. The plane these 2 women would be working on their flight to Florida was called number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401 had been. In fact, plane number 318 actually had some original parts from Flight 401 on it, because it would turn out after that huge investigation was done on the crash, the investigators discovered lots of parts from Flight 401 were still in pretty good shape. And so after rigorously testing them and ensuring they did really work, those parts were actually installed on other L-1011 jets in the Eastern Airline fleet. Now, for the record, this was not considered an inappropriate thing to do. These parts were extremely expensive and they worked perfectly fine, and they were not involved in causing Flight 401 to crash. And so no one batted an eye when Eastern Airlines put these parts on their other planes. So Ginny and Denise, along with several other Eastern Airlines flight attendants, board plane number 318, and after takeoff, the flight attendants began going through the very long and drawn-out process of getting food and drink for the nearly 200 people on board the flight. And so the way the flight attendants divvied up the work is they would have some of the attendants on the main level of the plane in the cabin taking orders from all the passengers, and then the other flight attendants would be down on the lower level, the second level of the plane where the kitchen was, preparing all the food and drinks. And so at some point during this process, Denise, who was up on the main level helping with taking orders, realized she didn't have anything to do. She had taken all the orders she could, and so she decided she would head down to the second level, to the kitchen, where her good friend Ginny was, to see if she could help her. But ironically, as Denise got in the elevator in the back of the plane and began heading down to the second level, Ginny, who was on the second level, discovered she did not have anything to do. She'd already prepped her cart, and so she had gotten into the other elevator and began going up to the main level to see if Denise needed any help. And so the 2 women literally passed each other in their elevators, but didn't see each other. And so once Ginny arrived at the main level, the cabin level, she got off the elevator and she walked down the aisle and she began asking around to the other attendants if they knew where Denise was, and they would tell her, oh, she just left a minute ago to go down to see you. And so after a couple of minutes, Ginny would leave the main level and go back down the elevator to the lower level to find Denise. Now, to understand what happens next, you need to have a basic understanding of the layout of the second level. So when you come down on either of those 2 elevators, when the doors open, you'd be looking down a stretch of hallway, basically the length of the plane from the back towards the front. And when you stepped off the elevator, you'd be stepping into the middle of the kitchen. Now, the kitchen was very, very cramped, and on the left side was a row of ovens that were all stacked up against each other, and then on the other side, on the right side, was a row of cabinets and cupboards.
You've flown dozens of times, but tonight feels different. The plane door seals shut with a hiss, and as the engines roar to life, a voice inside you whispers, "Don't get on this flight." At first, it's just turbulence. The cabin shakes, overhead bins rattling. Nervous laughter ripples through the passengers. The captain's calm voice comes on. Just a rough patch of air. But then you notice something strange. The seatbelt sign flickers, not on and off, but like it's pulsing, almost alive. You glance out the window. For a moment, you swear the stars are moving too close, like the plane isn't flying through the sky. It's falling into it. Suddenly, the lights cut out. Darkness swallows the cabin. You hear oxygen masks drop, passengers gasping. But when you reach for your mask, it's warm, like someone's been breathing into it already. Screams erupt as the plane plunges, nose tilting down. The aisles fill with chaos. But over the roar of the engines, you hear something impossible, a voice whispering in unison with the wind. This flight never lands. You look to your left. The seat beside you is empty, yet you feel fingers gripping your arm, cold and relentless. The ground rushes up in the window. Faster and faster. You squeeze your eyes shut, bracing for impact. Then silence. When you open your eyes, you're still strapped in your seat. But the cabin is empty. Rows and rows of vacant chairs stretch before you. The only sound is the steady hum of engines. And then, the intercom crackles. Welcome aboard. Please remain seated forever.